Welcome to Delegation of Nursing Tasks in Iowa Schools, another of the core competency presentations given by Mary Ann Strawhacker, nurse consultant at Heartland AEA. The 2019 position statement that was written to guide administrators and supervisors regarding nursing delegation can also give some good insight to school nurses as well. In looking at this particular delegation position statement, it's important to note that delegation falls under the 21st century school nursing practice competency of care coordination. In it, the nurse is making sure that a child has everything they need within the school setting in order to be safe and to have their needs met. Ideally, a school nurse would be present all day, every day, but we all know that that isn't possible. And it can be very likely that somebody within the school has experience doing a task or procedure. Maybe they have a child that has special needs, or a parent or grandparent, and they've helped perform a procedure. It's not always true that you're starting from scratch, although many times you will be providing that initial education. The foundation of delegation really is built on 3 different principles. And as we look at those, it's very important to make sure that up front we've taken care of these 3 principles before we ever make that decision to delegate. The first one is, how stable is that child? How stable is if they have a gastrostomy tube feeding that needs to be done, urinary cath, some type of procedure? How predictable is it? Every single time they have that procedure, does it go as planned? Are there any other concerns? And that's really important judgment to make, and it's impossible to make that judgment unless you've actually performed the procedure it is that you want to delegate. And it's important to have performed it on that particular child to figure out exactly how to teach it. The second is making sure that to whoever you decide to delegate, that they have basic competencies, such as they're going to maintain confidentiality, they're going to follow your directions precisely. It's somebody who will call you in and ask questions if they have any, and it's somebody who won't be nervous, somebody who won't panic if something goes wrong. And then finally, how much supervision is required from you in order to delegate that task? Is this a task that can be easily taught? Is it a task that, if delegated, you could provide that intermittent check-in, make sure they're still doing the procedure the way that you taught them? That's very important as well. If it's a procedure that maybe you're a little hesitant to delegate, don't delegate it until you have all those details worked out and feel more comfortable. Iowa Code lays down a really nice foundation. The latest version was developed in 2021, and it really spells out the difference between an assignment, delegation from nurse to nurse, and or from nurse to someone who doesn't have a nursing license. These principles are spelled out A to G. I'm going to just briefly touch on some of these. It's important that not only you model a skill, demonstrate a skill, but it's also important that that person perform a return demonstration to you so that you can correct and offer additional instruction as needed. It's important that that task is pretty clean. And by clean, I mean that it doesn't require a bunch of decision making. If you follow the steps as you have described them and written them out, should have the same outcome every time. The basic cutoff for what we can delegate comes down to not being able to delegate anything that requires a licensed practical nurse level of education. We can only delegate to those who, in the scope of employment, are asked to do procedures. Now, if it's a one-to-one associate for a child, that should be part of the job description. If, on the other hand, the employee tells you, well, I never knew about this, follow up on that. Because if they didn't agree to that on initial employment, chances are good they wouldn't be the person to delegate the task to. Making sure that there's minimal risk to the child. If something should go wrong, you're going to obviously teach correct technique Sometimes there can be some variances, and that's important that that paraprofessional understands that you're always available for questions and for providing additional guidance. Also, it's important that there is that communication back and forth. Anytime that there's a question or concern, you need to be accessible and making sure that not only are you checking in periodically to make sure things haven't changed, but also that the outcome for the student is consistent as well. Important to note that LPN scope of practice is spelled out very nicely in Chapter 6 of the Iowa Administrative Code. A licensed practical nurse participates in care. They don't initiate it, so they don't conduct that initial assessment. They're the ones that are implementing the plan that you have developed. They certainly can provide ongoing assessment. They have some capability, but they cannot provide that initial. And if there's something that goes wrong, they're going to need your assistance in order to troubleshoot that. LPNs also have a very limited scope of practice when it comes to school nursing. Because school nursing is an independent practice realm, LPNs must practice under the limitations of what you have spelled out in the individual health plan. And it has to be a delegated task to that licensed practical nurse. Lots of good delegation resources out there. This one is easily Googled on the internet. I also have it included in my class that I teach for new school nurses. What we never can delegate is that experience, the critical judgment, any type of responsibility for the actual task itself. We also can't delegate that. So we're responsible for that initial decision to delegate. We're also responsible for that student outcome and making sure that there's no deviation between what we taught and what it is that that student receives. This is a good graphic from that article that I just wanted to pull in primarily because your employer also has a duty under delegation, and that is to make sure that you have the resources you need in order to provide safe care. We can never delegate a nursing task because we're short-staffed. We can delegate care if it is a safe way to provide care, and we can provide that ongoing supervision. And if you look at the different responsibilities, and please feel free to pause the recording a minute and look at this slide, the person to whom you're delegating accepts that delegation and agrees to make certain that they're following the instruction you gave them. The employer also has some training and teaching liability in this as well. And it's important that as nurses, we make sure our employer understands what our responsibilities are as a registered nurse in the state of Iowa. Talked a little bit about this, but I want to make sure that I really spell this out. There should be policies, role descriptions, job descriptions, all kinds of opportunities to continually develop staff, and making sure that there's overlap, especially if you have a health associate who is performing some tasks related to an individual student. You need to be able to see that staff person performing the task and to offer that additional guidance and training. You should already be familiar with the 5 rights of delegation. If it seems like there's a lot of overlap in some of this instruction, it's because there is. A number of different good sources are out there, and I've tried to pull as many as I can to show you how that overlap affects your practice. First of all, we have to be very certain that we've delegated a task that's easily completed, can be taught, and can be performed by somebody who does not have a nursing license. Right circumstances are important too. If you are a nurse who has 4 buildings and you are 20 miles away if something goes wrong, then only the most stable kids and stable procedures can you employ nursing delegation. The right person is also important. You want somebody who isn't afraid to ask questions, somebody who's not afraid to tell you if there's been something that hasn't gone right. And then finally, the right supervision, which I've already talked a lot about. There is a document out there. It is the interpretive statement for delegation of health services in Iowa schools. It's a little old right now. It's 2016 to 2017, but there is nothing that has replaced it. We're hoping that maybe someday soon there might be some additional guidance put in there, because there have been some additional publications. But right now, the basics are in there, and it's a good document that I would highly advise that you read through. There are times when you should not delegate. And if you're being asked to do that by someone who is even your immediate supervisor, there are times when you should decline. The top one that I can think of is if you're not able to do anything to help this person if they get into trouble. So in other words, you are 20 miles away, and if something goes wrong, 911 is maybe 20, 30 minutes away. You're 20, 30 minutes away. If it's something that is that likely to go wrong, then I would tell you not to delegate it, and instead to change your schedule so that you can be in that building during the time that procedure needs to be done. If it's somebody that has never performed the task before, you need to be there the first few times that it's performed in order to determine whether or not they have a successful return demonstration. Kind of a reiteration of what was said earlier, but you need to be able to intervene and assist if needed. If you don't have the opportunity to do that, don't delegate. Reasons to decide against delegation. You sometimes will have a person who accepts the delegation, wants to do it, has read through all the materials, and you get to that return demonstration and they can't perform the task. That is a reason not to delegate. If they consistently don't document, that could be a reason. Sometimes also, students' health status changes. They might have been stable before and now suddenly they're not. You have carefully performed your assessment, gathered all the information you need. Sometimes it will make you really uncomfortable to think of delegating, and follow your gut in that instance. Don't delegate if you are not comfortable with that decision. What does it mean to supervise nursing delegation? There again, the new Nurse Practice Act from February of 2021 goes through and spells all of that out. B really speaks to matching the needs of the person who is performing the task with the task and making sure that you're supervising appropriately. In other words, if they're struggling, you're going to be supervising more often. You're going to be clearly stating how to perform, what should be the outcome, and making sure that there's good communication. You're going to ongoing monitor this. This isn't something you teach, see that they're competent, and then forget about. Making sure that at least yearly, if not more often, you're looking at your individual health plan to make sure that everything that you've written in there, those outcome statements, are all pertinent. Updating the plan of care, knowing that even though you have taught somebody else how, you still are accountable for that initial decision to delegate, and to make sure that that task is being done correctly. And you are going to promote that safe environment where even if they haven't done what it was that they were taught to do, that individual needs to feel safe coming to you and saying, hey, I made a mistake and I need some assistance making sure this doesn't happen again. Also know that we have education code that applies to delegation. Anytime we are administering medication ourselves, our nursing license takes care of that. But when an unlicensed person delivers medication, it is considered a delegated task. And initially, when they take the medication course through AEA Learning Online, there is that return demonstration. For special health services, there are also some requirements out there, and those make sure to note that we need to have orders on file if it's a procedure that needs orders. Once you make that decision to delegate, you need to create a paragraph that explains your rationale for delegation. And it really goes back to documenting all those things we've talked about should be in place before you ever delegate. These 5 criteria should be included in any delegation paragraph. As I read through those that people have written, the thing that's most often missed is that ongoing supervision. How often are you going to check in with them? Are you going to wait until there's a problem, or are you going to make it something that's routinely done? Iowa Code, Educational Code 28114 defines supervision a little differently than the Nurse Practice Act. The Iowa Educational Code actually breaks it into 3 different types of supervision. I think this is very helpful, especially combined with the Nurse Practice Act. So either you are there when that task is being performed, you are in the same room, or you are not. That's 1 and 2. And then 3 is finally that you could be on call. There are some procedures that are so routine that all needs to happen is that you can be located and you can be asked a question if need be. Educational Code also spells out that you get to define that level of supervision, and ultimately you make the decision of whether or not to delegate. You are responsible for that instruction. There are some good resources, and I'll show you some of those toward the end, that you can pull in to help with that instruction. And then you're going to make sure that you have the consent of the person to whom you delegated. This was passed years ago, and it really relates to the fact that teachers are teachers, and they don't always feel comfortable performing health tasks. Same way with an associate, may not feel comfortable. This states that you cannot force somebody to perform health services, and if they object at all, find another individual to whom to delegate. In summary, we're looking at, can the task be delegated? Is it part of that person's duties routinely? And can you provide that supervision as needed? If the answer is no to any of those, you should not delegate. Let's talk a little bit about the paperwork. I showed you already the summary paragraph that surrounds delegation. And that should be located someplace in the health file for a student. Some districts will use the file folder itself, will have a place to document. That might be where you do it. You might also do it on a teaching sheet where you're documenting the return demonstration. As long as you have it captured somewhere and can pull it up, that's what's important. Include delegation in that student's individual health plan. List any trainings provided, any plans that you have for supervision and protocols. This is an actual example that I lifted from a real individual health plan, so it's not perfect. If you read through this, you'll see the instruction is pretty well spelled out, except for the actual procedure, how to suction, that I think could have been stated a little more clearly. Also, in there, it talks about when to notify the nurse. It did not list the supervision, so I would have an intervention number 8 be that you will check with the paraprofessional weekly to see if there are any questions or concerns and to provide additional instruction as needed. When you do a demonstration or return demonstration, there should be a record to document that on. These can look really different. This is one I created years ago, but there are a number of these sheets available through other locations as well. It's just something that says, what it is that you taught, and then what was the date and when did they return a successful demonstration. Wishes is an amazing site. It was developed in Wisconsin in response to a grant. They have not only training program for unlicensed assistive personnel, but they also have different types of procedure sheets. They have skills checklists. Make sure you check them out if you're going to teach a common procedure to somebody in the school. If this would be a nice place to find something that you could then edit to fit that particular student. And then finally, reevaluate that decision to delegate periodically. If there's a change in staff, if there's a change in the student's health condition, it's not that once you delegate a task that you can't take it back. it goes back to making sure that there is an ongoing need and ongoing safe performance of that particular procedure. This is from the 2016 National Council of State Boards of Nursing Guidance. Honestly, sometimes these things do happen. And that is, once you've delegated to a para, if that para is going to be gone, they think they can teach another para how to do their job while they're gone. We know that is not true. You determine to whom you're going to delegate, and if that individual is going to be gone, they need to let you know. Yes, it could be that you train and delegate to somebody else in the absence. Ideally, you have multiple people trained, but make sure that delegatee knows that the only reason they're able to do that procedure is because you have trained them. The other thing, too, is if you pull back a delegated task, that individual can no longer perform the task, and it would be performing nursing without a license if it's not under delegation. So very, very important to stress that. It has happened that the person who was initially instructed and delegated a certain task suddenly isn't performing it safely. Either they aren't documenting, or they forget, or they don't follow protocol. You can rescind delegation. Now, I would tell you to do that with the full knowledge, cooperation of an administrator. There again, very important that you put that in writing and the reason why you're rescinding, and then you are responsible for making sure that task gets performed until you can get somebody else trained and on board and safely providing it. If you have any questions or concerns, you know where to reach me. Thanks for listening, and look for the next presentation.